Hello, and thank you for joining us today with this American Enterprise Institute panel where we have leaders from academia and from public service and from the legal field who are joining us today to talk about clinical trial representation and why it matters. And by clinical trial representation, I mean are the groups represented who have the epidemiology of the disease being studied, and today we're going to focus on that as it relates to race and ethnicity. In a moment, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Just to note, this event will be being recorded, so please do share with those who may not be able to join us. I also want to let you know that in addition to being a visiting scholar with the American Enterprise Institute, I am a biopharma consultant to life sciences companies, so that kind of presents a full perspective of my perspectives and potential biases. So if I could start with Marcella Alshon, our first panelist.
Thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, Kirsten, for organizing us. My name is Marcella Alshon, and I'm a professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. My background is both in infectious disease and as a PhD economist.
And Marcella, did you have a little bit you're going to share with us that kind of provides some more context around your background and work?
Yes, absolutely. So I have been interested I study health equity and the economics of producing health equity. And most recently, I've been working with a group of scholars at Stanford and here at Harvard Business School as well, trying to understand how to improve. Actually, the first question was, does representation actually matter in terms of clinical decision-making? And to make progress on that question, we did survey experiments, including both doctors and patients. So does the representation or the share, we were interested in representation for Black Americans in particular, does it actually influence whether or not a doctor will prescribe a drug and whether or not a patient will update positively on the efficacy of the drug given a certain set of trial results. So I'll go ahead and share my screen with that as background to give you a sense of this. So just back up here for a moment. So we ended up surveying both purposefully physicians that worked mostly in areas with a higher white population, and physicians that worked in places that there were some Black population around as well. And then we were able to verify that their panels had, for those who worked in areas that were predominantly white, there were physicians that treated mostly white patients. So we call those PWPs. And again, we are experimentally varying, so randomizing both the efficacy of a given drug and the share Black in the trial itself. We're randomizing those two aspects. And what we see here in this slide, and this is really speaking again to the question of does representation matter, is that the more efficacious the drug is, that's on the x-axis, and this was a diabetes medicine, so this is efficacious in terms of A1C, the more likely on the y-axis the physician was willing to prescribe the drug. And PWP is our little acronym for physicians that treat mostly white patients. Interestingly, we see the same slope and the same pattern for physicians that treat at least some Black patients. So again, more efficacious the drug, this again, diabetic medication, a bigger reduction in A1C, more willing the physician that treats Black patients is to prescribe the medicine, but there's sort of a level shift down. And that's conditional on, this is what that vertical line means, non-representative data. So when the data are non-representative, we see this gap open up in the likelihood that the physician is willing to prescribe the drug, and that's conditional on efficacy. These are conditional on the drug having this amount of efficacy shown. You see a gap open up between physicians that treat white patients and physicians that treat Black patients purely on the sample characteristics. What's great about the study, at least for someone that works in health equity and is used to sort of documenting disparities, is that when we actually show those same physicians that treat Black patients more representative trials, and we varied it from 0 to 30%, and we considered representative anything that was above the sort of clinicaltrials.gov median average of 5%, we see that we can actually close some of those gaps. And I won't show it here. It's just just an introduction. But basically, the more representative you make that trial, the more physicians that treat Black patients actually seem to respond over that domain we tested of 0 to 30% Black. On the patient side, we actually find the exact same phenomenon, which, as I mentioned, I'm an MD, PhD, so it's nice to see that physicians are kind of implementing the preferences and being good agents, if you will, for the patients themselves. So when Black and white patients are shown non-representative data, this is now for a blood pressure medication, we see that actually white patients update more in the sense that they say that the drug will work as effectively on them as shown in the trial itself, and Black patients update less. But very similar to the situation that I showed you before on the physician side, we can close those gaps by providing more representative trial data. So I hope that, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the subsequent discussion, but I hope that kind of maybe frames out for all of you why I am on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Susan, can I ask you to go next and describe what you do and also your connection to this topic of accurate representation of clinical trial data?
Sure, and thanks so much for the invitation and the opportunity to join the conversation. So I'm Susan Winkler, and I serve as the CEO at the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA, and we're a nonprofit, non-government group that helps the FDA do more to protect and promote the public health. So not surprisingly, some of the work that we do for them relates to this topic of representativeness in clinical trials, and it's come up in a couple of different places. In one, we did work with the agency as it related to COVID-19 vaccines and consumer acceptance. And what we heard in those listening sessions, and we focused on traditionally underrepresented populations. There was a very clear request from those populations to be accurately represented in the clinical trials. They wanted to know if the vaccine would work for people who looked and lived like them. And it was one of the kind of top concerns and questions that they had about a COVID-19 vaccine. Other work that we do for the agency includes, convening conversations about representation in clinical trials and what works, what might the agency do more. And I'll talk a little bit later about a project we're working on to try and improve the collection of race and ethnicity data in healthcare delivery and payment so that we have a better understanding of the use of products. So I'm come to the foundation after a career in nonprofits and as a consultant, and having spent some time at the FDA. And one of the things I love about being at the foundation is I get to be in use my pharmacist training and my attorney training, practicing neither, but helping to make great connections for the agency and the public it serves.
Thank you so much. Now, Sarah, could you also introduce yourself and your connection to this topic?
Yes, hi, and echoing everyone else, it's a great pleasure and honor to be on this webinar today. I'm Sarah Thompson Schick, and I am counsel at Reed Smith in the Houston office. I'm an FDA regulatory and compliance attorney, and I focus my practice on advising medical products clients on a number of medical and scientific issues, including on clinical research. Most recently, Kirsten and I had the great pleasure of having a paper that we as I like to call it, our labor of love for about a year and a half on addressing the idea and the concept of regulatory incentives, introducing regulatory incentives to enhance clinical trial diversity, specifically as it relates to pivotal trials. And that was recently published in the Food and Drug Law Journal back in October. So not only I've worked on this issue in the legal context and thinking about how clients can potentially approach this particular issue as they're navigating their clinical development programs. And I look forward to having a deeper conversation about this over the next hour.
Wonderful, thank you all. I'm going to share a few slides, just give everyone watching kind of the same background on this topic. And so today what we're going to discuss is, why does representation matter? Is it a nice to have because being inclusive is the right thing ethically? Or is it an essential to have because we need to get the most out of our healthcare system from our medicines? So thank you so much for our panelists joining today. So just a bit of background. There's been more than a decade of initiatives by the FDA, by NIH, and by other private and public institutions, including legislation with the intent to make clinical trials more representative. I'm going to show you a slide in just a moment here that shows we're still falling far behind on trials reflecting even just the US population, which in many disease states, there is more than average representation from Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans, particularly in areas like cardiovascular disease. And even those trials are not enrolling a population that reflects the underlying epidemiology. There's obstacles built from centuries of racism and also economic disenfranchisement, which means that it can be everything from, it affects transportation and the kind of jobs certain groups are doing, which makes it harder to participate in the trial. But even more essentially for a sponsor enrolling in the trial, it affects underlying health and the expectation of a certain degree of health improvement or a certain degree of outcome change from that drug. When the expected outcome change is lower, that means you have to enroll more people in the study to be able to detect a difference between the drug being studied and the placebo. And that is expensive and more time consuming. And remember, when a company is sponsoring a trial, they're not only considering the cost of the trial, but they're considering every month delay is another month of revenue. So it becomes just adds more risk to an already risky endeavor when you know that your trial has the potential to be longer and costlier. So we're going to talk today about what else is necessary, and I'm going to take you through in just a moment some slides that share the most recent legislation and policy proposals. We're also going to talk about private investment. This idea that Sarah and I kind of explored of incentives. Do we need maybe some carrots in addition to sticks for not having a representative trial? Because typically it's been carrots, really financial incentives, that has spurned interest by biopharmaceutical companies and trial sponsors in areas such as rare disease, oncology, pediatric studies. So these are some of the headwinds that are facing us to achieve more accurate race and ethnic inclusion in pivotal trials. Recruiting, everything from sort of historical mistrust, but also where trials are currently being conducted today. That can include academic centers. Going to sites where you would find a more representative population has the benefit of making that population easier to recruit, but has the downside of, if it's a site that hasn't done a lot of trials, that poses a risk to the program for the sponsor, and they factor both of those things into consideration. And then the typical inclusion and exclusion criteria, there's a much higher incidence of hypertension, cardiovascular risk, mental health, and other comorbidities, and those are quite often exclusion criteria in a trial. So if you take those people out, you're disproportionately taking out people who are, Black, Latino, Native American, and in certain conditions, Asian. And then the expected efficacy of the drug, I sort of already covered that the expected treatment response rate affects how many people you have to enroll in the trial to see a difference between the drug being studied and the placebo.
And Kirsten, I think you had slides for these. We're not seeing those yet.
Oh my goodness, thank you. What's going on here? Thank you so much. There we are. There we go, right? Thank you. You're a true friend. Let's see. I'm not going to go over the content again. So here we are. And these slides will be posted on the website too for those who want them. So just doing kind of a progress check on where we are today. The green graph shows the US population, the dark green line. And then we compare that to who is being enrolled in trials. And I've selected only the trials that are pivotal, meaning for drug approval. People also call these phase 3. And I did the ones where 50% or more of the population was from the US. So as you see, Blacks are 13% of the US population and 8% and 9% the year prior of enrollment in pivotal studies. Hispanics 19% versus now 11%. And the Asian representation is actually closer to their representation in the US population. Now, if we look at of the 53 new drug approvals in 2020, only 6 enrolled Blacks and Latinos at the population benchmark, 2 in 2019, and I think quite starkly 0 for oncology drugs in 2020 and 2019 enrolled a representative population of Blacks and Latinos. And again, many cancers are more prevalent and more deadly in those populations. So not including them in this study, as Marcella showed, could present a significant risk to trust, but also to the information that is collected. And there's also just different health challenges by race and ethnicity, and probably should see more emphasis in certain diseases if we were to look at this from a perspective of who is most likely to have them and have the worst health outcomes. And then the changes as a result of major events, and the green graph shows the increase in depressive symptoms. This is obviously during the period of the pandemic. And what you see here is the increase in Asian Americans was far greater than it was in whites, Blacks, and Latinos. And then Latinos ended up with a much higher incidence of depressive symptoms. That both speaks to need to treat, but again, thinking about often mental health as an exclusion criteria, you have a lot bigger portion of the population that, if this were to continue, might be excluded from clinical study. And then, just to kind of show how this affects your trial size, I used data that is published from the EAGLE study, and this was a huge post-market study that was done on smoking cessation drugs. And what's interesting about this study is they enrolled 25% Black population. It was a several thousand person study, and they also broke out the response rates for Blacks and whites, and they also broke out the response rates for people with psychiatric conditions and without. And so what you see here is, and varenicline is one of the active agents being studied, the response rate is lower for Blacks than whites in both the group without psychiatric conditions and with. So what that would mean, if we were then to just do a sample size calculation, is to detect the difference versus placebo. If you had a diverse trial, you would need 217 people in each arm. And if you had a non-diverse trial, non-representative trial, you would need 194. When you factor in that it costs more to recruit non-white participants, that results in a trial that's 32% larger and 100% more expensive. So while it is the right thing to do, with the exception of probably the larger companies, is it's going to be more of a challenge for smaller biotech companies to meet with the goal of enrolling representative study. And then this is sort of a laundry list of initiatives that have happened with the FDA over the last 20 years. and a lot of information gathering and coalition building and action planning has resulted most recently in guidance on how companies should approach developing a accurate representation plan. The draft guidance was released recently, and basically encourages the development of a diversity plan, recommends meeting with the FDA, and also gives companies sort of a roadmap to what should be included in a diversity plan. Most recently, there's a piece of legislation introduced that is under consideration in both the House and Senate that would require NIH-funded studies to have a diversity plan and also to achieve accurate representation in their enrollment and or explain why they can't, such as, you know, in the occurrence of a rare disease or another population where it's difficult to capture, to enroll certain groups. And they also will need to describe how they will capture race and ethnicity data and sub-analyze those populations. And then in the omnibus spending bill that was just recently passed, the FDA guidance will go from guidance to a requirement, where trials will be where trial sponsors will be required to submit a plan for how they're going to enroll an accurately representative population. Again, with certain exceptions, the FDA is going to be required to finalize that guidance. They will hold a public workshop in partnership with industry, academia, and others. And then they will be required to report on what happened. Did the trial sponsors actually enroll those populations? And if not, you know, what were some of the reasons provided? So now I'm going to switch to stopping to talk and hearing from all of our panelists. So I'm going to start off with Sarah, and really ask you. Companies have stated the intent, and many of them have invested millions of dollars in launching programs intended to get accurate representation in their trials. What do you think of the reason that we still aren't getting there? That most drugs that are approved don't have representation that reflects the U.S. population?
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. Some of the points you hit on with your presentation, specifically in thinking about mistrust of the healthcare system among underrepresented populations. There's been even more recent reporting that's not specifically related to clinical trials, but just discussing maternal mortality among Black American women, other issues that African Americans face as they interact with the healthcare system. So there's a lot of just who do you trust? And so if you don't have trust when you're having regular interactions with the healthcare system, how are you going to trust being part of what many would just call an experiment, essentially? So that's part of it. The other thing is also thinking about where we get our patients. How do we access patients who are participating in clinical trials? We often go to, as you said, academic medical centers, which many call them centers of excellence. And, really, I've been ruminating more recently on the idea of how can we cultivate communities of excellence? Where are the communities that we can partner with? And this is starting to happen for sure, but communities that we can partner with, community health centers, local physicians that do have the trust of the patients and the communities that they serve. How can we access these communities of excellence or create these communities of excellence that would give us greater access to the patient populations that we really need access to? And then also thinking about how some of the studies are financed, and specifically larger companies are uniquely positioned to meet a lot of these requirements and encouragements that are coming down from a regulatory perspective. It's a little bit more difficult for smaller companies, and especially those that are targeting issues such as rare disease, smaller oncology indications, for example. So many of these smaller companies don't have any products on the market yet. So their primary focus really, truly is we have to get a product on the market so that we can commercialize and get revenue. so then we can continue doing what we're doing. And it can be difficult when your primary goal is to capitalize on the financial aspect, and you're not really thinking about and factoring in diversity when you're trying to move quickly and make sure that you have a sustainable organization. So those are just a few factors. There are many, many more, but those are some that I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Wonderful. Susan, do you have any other additions? Because I know you've been working with companies for a long while on this.
Yeah, so Sarah covered them quite well as you in the overview. But I think it's that combination of where are you recruiting, and what is the who will navigate the recruitment process, and who is conducting the trial, right? And so the idea that we could shift from the centers of excellence to communities of excellence is so necessary, right? To get outside of the typical areas where we would recruit, or even if you navigate and you're in the trial, if it's a significant burden to have to travel there, we really have to kind of flip this on its head and say, how can we better integrate research with care delivery in an ethical, equitable manner?
So Marcella, you set us up beautifully with some of the research you've done. So why does it matter? Why does it matter if there is a lack of trust in the clinical study? What are the impacts on health outcomes or system costs?
Well, just to build off of the last responses, I think, trust definitely affects demand. So we want to acknowledge that, and there's very simple Bayesian models that would deliver that, but trust really has to be earned. And one of the things that Sarah said with respect to communities of excellence is that there are templates that industry and academia can use. In fact, in our research, we find that we're focused on racial disparities in clinical trial enrollment and the diffusion of new medications. Across conditions, there's quite a lot of variation in terms of the median share enrolled Black. And for various reasons, HIV/AIDS stands out as really an outlier, particularly compared to some of the other major causes of chronic disease, such as more recently cancer and ADRD, the network that's being built there, in terms of having just a much higher median share Black, and than either cancer or ADRD, or even hypertension or diabetes. And we can directly correlate the relationship between the higher median share Black in those trials and the higher diffusion of new to the market medications for those conditions. In other words, the more that condition has representation of Black individuals in the trials, the more diffusion of the new drug we see amongst the Black population. And, is it solely or only trial representation? I think it's more complicated than that, of course, but I think that is the focus of today. So we'll start there. But there's also pull factors. Speaking of the work, Kirsten, that you and Sarah have done, there's the Ryan White Care Act that is the funder of Last Resort, which allows those new medications to flow to more indigent patients. But to Susan's point, what allows HIV/AIDS to have this better representation? When we look at the data, we can see that those trials are being run out of safety net hospitals on a much more frequent basis than we see for either cancer or ADRD, which tends to hew very, very closely to the AMC networks. And so, it's fundamentally at this point, not geographic determinism, but there is a very, very close spatial relationship between where the trials are run and the composition of them.
Thank you. So Susan, in your role as a leader of the Reagan-Udall Foundation, and you've also been a consultant and advisor to biopharma companies in your history. What do you think has worked in the past to help increase the representativeness of the data? Which companies are the best positioned to do this, and which are not? And maybe you want to, comment on which therapeutic areas maybe are going to be the biggest challenges.
The one factor is if the company is intentional about this, right? And having that patient-centric commitment. So not just, it can't be a check the box or the FDA told me to do this solely. It's that idea that being more representative is being more patient-centric, and then it carries through in the work. So I think that's a piece. It does help when the FDA sets parameters with the understanding, as they did in their guidance. It's not about setting a number per se, but rather, who are you trying to reach and how will you reach that representative population? As we've talked about, kind of getting out of the typical approach and the kind of where you would typically go to an academic medical center or a center of excellence, that it's really important to go beyond that. But one of the challenges that all companies face is that to enroll a reflective population, you have to know the race and ethnicity of the affected population. And we don't have very good data about that from our healthcare delivery and payment systems. So we've got a little bit of a tension in that, in order to say, here's my target population and here's the kind of where it shakes out in representativeness, where it may be more prevalent in one group versus another. We don't have great data on that in healthcare delivery and payment. So then it gets harder to then show your representativeness in a clinical trial. So there's a bit of a circle here that we have to improve all around. But I think the companies, it is easier for the more established and the larger company to pursue this with, more intently versus in, a smaller company and trying to pursue it. And certainly where you have, it's going to be more difficult in smaller populations, right? In a rare disease, or where you have a number of exclusion criteria. And I should say where it's historically been difficult to do clinical trials, such as in substance use disorder, where we just have so many exclusion criteria and variation in the disease itself that we're trying to navigate. Those things all add up and make it more complicated. I should have started with complications and gone to the solutions, and that would have put us in a better position, Kirsten. Sorry.
All right. That's all right. So Sarah, in your role both as a lawyer advising clients on regulatory issues, and in your past life when you worked in the clinical trial implementation in contract research organizations, do you see innovations such as remote-enabled clinical trials, technology that can capture endpoints, at home? Do you see those as making a significant impact on the percentage of racial and ethnic minorities enrolled in studies?
I think they definitely could. I would love to see more data. I think we really got a lot of insight into how this could work during COVID. FDA was really good about putting out guidance and then frequently updating it about how do we reach patients who are participating in clinical trials during COVID-19. And one of those methodologies was remote monitoring. It's something that I know still continues. Decentralized clinical trials is really a big deal right now. And I think all of these mechanisms could work. And I think that they are to some degree working, but I'd love to, again, see a little bit more data. What actually happened during COVID? What's happening now? Because there are a number of companies that are starting up around decentralized clinical trials that are focusing exclusively on those types of offerings. So that to me, I think is the next step, is great ideas. And I know FDA is on track to watching how this develops and then get the data. And I think that's the next step in this conversation for sure.
Excellent. Marcella, do you have any experience evaluating that type of outreach and its ability to reach underrepresented groups?
Yes, a bit, specifically with respect to demand for preventative care more broadly. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence that I'd love to circle back to on the importance of diversity and representation at the level of the PI and at the level of the physicians that are doing the outreach. I mean, one thing to build off the comment I had made earlier about the difference between AIDS and ADRD and cancer with the safety net hospitals is generally, if you looked at US, News World rankings of hospitals, or maybe even CMS star ratings of hospitals, you wouldn't necessarily see the safety net hospitals bubble to the top. But in given communities where those are the places where you can actually get care, they actually might have a much more established and trusting relationship with the patients that you're trying to recruit than other institutions that might be sending large bills or just simply denying care outright. So that's something to keep in mind. I think the other thing I wanted to mention, just as an economist, is that I think we should consider these fixed costs, building out an inclusive infrastructure, which is not just possibly, investments in remote technologies, or maybe training investments in human capital in places where that are not generally doing studies like FQHCs, federally qualified health centers, and the like. So those invest, but they're also sort of relationship building investments, but these are fixed costs. And once those are actually built and those are relationships established, whether they're built by the public sector or the private sector or a very large, company like Merck or Pfizer, then everyone can enjoy the sort of lower marginal costs of sort of maintaining those relationships and finding the patients that you need. One of the challenges with asking the private sector to do this kind of alone is that, why would company A want to do this when company B could possibly free ride on it? But it is the case that if it's about building a more inclusive infrastructure that just is high fixed costs to begin with, then basically even the smaller businesses and firms should be able to kind of exploit those networks.
And if I could jump on that, I think Marcella reminded us and brought us back to that trust word. There is a significant trust deficit about clinical research, I would say in the United States, because I don't know more broadly, but we have a trust deficit. And so one of the ways to not be successful is to try and enhance the representation of your clinical trial by dropping into a community and having the first conversation be, please participate in my research. That we have to repair the trust deficits from historic racism, and we have to correct the current discrimination that occurs, and we have to come into improving and addressing those dynamics, and then talk about participation in research, which is why I think it's so important to move to that communities of excellence idea, that it's not parachuting in and saying, we want you to join this research. It's about changing how we think about care delivery and research and having that representation. Because I mentioned that in our COVID-19 vaccine listening sessions that people wanted to be represented. They wanted to be accurately represented, because there was also a significant concern that the clinical trials were being done only in certain populations, and that there was active experimentation. And so it was about the kind of being what we're talking about, right? Representing in the incidence of the situation, but not being over experimented upon or under represented. And that's not a conversation or a change that we make by coming in with a single great idea and then leaving the next day.
So Susan, the FDA has issued guidance to sponsors on what they would like to see in a accurate representation enrollment plan in phase 3. Now we know it's going to be finalized. And so what elements of that guidance, so as it is finalized, from what you're hearing when you work with companies, what elements of that guidance are, clear and most helpful? Where is there still remaining work to be done? What types of information and infrastructure are needed for companies to be able to not just propose an action plan, but actually be able to do it?
Yeah. So what we hear is that, it's helpful that it's kind of a set your own goal, right? In the versus here's a hard and fast number to address per se. There are those, I think, who would say, well, then also tell us how to get there. The guidance doesn't do that, right? That's for the companies to determine. I think one of the, I'll go back to one of the things we have to improve is generally our conversations and our ability to collect race and ethnicity data in healthcare delivery and payment that will then support our ability to do that in clinical trials as well, just having a better understanding. So we hear that the guidance, I think there will be, a draft guidance gets a lot of attention. A draft guidance that now has a statute saying it needs to be finalized and enforced will get a higher level of attention. And so I expect us to hear more from companies about, providing additional comment to the agency about what they'd like to see changed in the final. But the idea that the company says, here's who I want to reach, and here's my plan to reach it, it is generally, received as a pretty good structure. But I think also then the ability to share will be important so that companies can share what worked. And then if again, we can, repairing those trust deficits really does help everyone. And anyone adding to those trust deficits detract for everyone.
So building on that, Sarah, what else would you consider if you were considering beyond the guidance that's been issued, specifically in the area of incentives or penalties to kind of motivate the behavior in the investment that you need to see to get accurate representation?
Yeah, so, obviously we've talked about incentives and thinking about specifically, mirroring them after what we do for serious diseases, expedited programs for serious diseases. It's interesting, and I don't have the exact quote or context, but there's been conversation about certain oncology products that were approved via the accelerated approval process, and now those approvals are being pulled back or questioned. And there was an official at FDA who essentially said these are not regulatory incentives, speaking about accelerated approval. And I thought that was interesting, and it got me thinking about, is there a way? It's not really about reframing it so much as thinking about how we approach it from a regulatory perspective that could potentially be palatable to regulators, to industry. So not just thinking about it as regulatory incentives, but essentially as programs that are enhancing diversity. And what do those programs look like? Because as we've talked about so far, this isn't just an industry-driven initiative. This is going to be a multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder initiative. And part of that is going to be the regulators who provide guidance, but who also might provide some avenues to help companies enhance the ways in which they are able to bring their clinical trials to diverse populations and to ensure accurate representation in those trials. So it may not just be an expedited program per se, but something that does bring companies to the table where they're not there because you made me do it, but you also are saying, I'm getting more conversations with you. We're getting to be creative together, and we get to help solve this problem together. That's the way that I think this is the way that we move forward, by making sure that from a larger societal perspective that is multidisciplinary, but also internally at the stakeholders, at industry, and academic medical centers and other institutions that are tackling this issue internally, not just thinking about it from a clinical operations perspective or an HR perspective, or however we're really looking at these issues, but bringing in all of the different stakeholders within the institutions, bringing in ethics and compliance, bringing in regulatory, bringing in ClinOps, bringing in all the different functions to figure out how do we solve this problem as we move forward. So there's a lot of different pieces that I think the guidance is a great jump off point. The legislation is a great jump off point, but where do we go next? And I think thinking about those governmental partnerships and then also those institutional partnerships to enhance diversity and developing those types of programs to get us there.
Wonderful. And on the topic of incentives and requirements, requiring a sponsor to submit an action plan for their pivotal study should yield more representative data in the label. There are other types of incentives, like the pediatric incentive, which offers some extra protection on the data exclusivity, basically more time on market to sponsors who conduct trials on children, regardless of the outcome. And they obviously have to demonstrate why a trial on children is appropriate. So, and I'll pose this to Susan first, and then Marcella. What do you think about the benefit of data collected upfront, which can potentially make for a longer trial, a little bit more of a delay for time to get to the market, but a more representative study in the end, or the studies being done to kind of make study certain populations after the fact and collect that information?
Yeah. So there's certainly a role and a place for post-market data, right? And that's a structure that has served served patients well, to say, here's what we know, and we're going to put it on the market, and then we're going to do some additional studies. I think that what we don't want to have happen is kind of we're always going to do it later. And so we want to make the improvements and then say, where can we strengthen it in both in the kind of pre-market and then the post-market work. One of the challenges we run into, if you want to do your post-market work on real world data, I'll come back to my hammering of, we don't have very good information in our real world data as it relates to race and ethnicity. So we really have to improve, we have to strengthen the collection and the connection of that data across different information systems. So I think there's definitely an opportunity for the clinical trial, and then doing some trials post-market.
Marcella, what additional points would you offer? And from your viewpoint as an economist, are there any risks that we need to mitigate to requiring representation upfront? Will companies just shy away from certain conditions? And if so, is there any way to avoid that happening?
Well, that's a great question. I think there is a couple of things that a couple of, again, case studies. So in the instance, in general, in the data, you see sort of a gap between the public sector and the private sector, and the median share Black within the trial, except for HIV. So HIV is not only higher, but the gap between public and private, public generally dominates. Public tends to have more representative, more Black representation in the trials, a publicly funded trial than a privately funded trial, but not for HIV. For HIV, they're both high and they're both close. And I think that is because, again, that the private sector is essentially leveraging the ACTG and the other networks that have already been built. There's no need for them to go and start from scratch. That would be a waste of, that would be excess costs for them without any benefit. They can just leverage some of the things that have already been built, by the public sector or by the private sector in the past. So that is one thing I just wanted to mention. I think it would depend on the specifics of how the guidance actually, the finalized guidance. Certainly, if there were some conditions in which the guidance applied and some where it didn't apply, of course, you would see then, you would be opening up possibly cost differentials. So it would probably be really important for the guidance, whatever it is, to be at least somewhat harmonized. So there's not the ability to kind of avoid by sort of selectively choosing certain conditions, or just kind of looking at a small subgroup of a condition as opposed to sort of a broader possible diagnostic category. There is another regulatory or just process-based innovation that HIV/AIDS brings, which I think we've seen the American Cancer Society also endorse, which is actually having community advisory boards sit on protocol development. And that, I think, one of the catchphrases I'd like to try and instill in everyone's head is that there's no substitute for representation. And that starts at the top and all during the process. And so it's really important that some of the PIs are from diverse backgrounds and bring their perspectives and their narratives to the story. It's very important that the community has their vision and their approaches brought in. Look, from a business perspective, you wouldn't want to find out, in the middle of trying to recruit for a phase 2 trial that, in fact, this is an actual anecdote, that having a van with the CT scan like parked outside of a church doesn't automatically bring patients to be screened for cancer. I mean, it doesn't really work that way. So that community advisory board and having diversity in the PIs also, I think, is an important policy that we could look to.
Excellent, thank you. And I've got a question from an audience member for our last question. And I think this is a little bit directed at me, and I should have acknowledged it. The person said, what about American Indians and people who live on reservations? And I had that slide that summarized the representation by groups. I followed what is in the FDA drug trial snapshot, but that is a very important point, especially as we've seen mortality from COVID, much higher incidence of mental health and substance issues, as well as other diseases, which much higher prevalence with American Indians. That is a group that should be included, even though it's a small percentage of the population. And speaking to some of the points about communities of excellence, given that there's already tribal health systems established, it does seem like a way that you could engage. Any other thoughts? And again, I apologize for not mentioning that when I showed up that slide.
So, Kirsten, I think it gives us a great example. We also have a data element problem, right? In that the race and ethnicity data is collected in different ways by different systems, and so you even that lack of consistency then may create a situation where in one health system you have a self-report in one way, In another health system, perhaps they used a really not recommended structure of assigning or right kind of observational piece. But let's imagine you have a situation where an individual's race and ethnicity data conflicts between systems because they have different ways of capturing it. You know, asking the Native American question in different ways or collecting it in different ways. Then you run into a situation where you've got a conflict and it probably drops out. And so then we don't know. So we have some work to do to improve what questions we ask and what data we capture about race and ethnicity. And I think that's part of what was illuminated by the question that you got. When we don't talk about it, we assume we haven't captured it, and there is not a good consistent, there is a consistent list from the Office of Management and Budget, which right is what FDA will be asking for, but we probably need to think through whether that's what patients would choose, and certainly we need to fix the inconsistencies in how the information is collected. So sorry to take us down a data element route there.
Well, thank you all so much. Any final thoughts that haven't been covered before we close? Well, then I'll just thank you all so much for making time for this discussion, and I look forward to more.